Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on the recently consulted Beyond Visual Line of Sight examination for operations outside of controlled airspace. My name is Simon Butler, and I'm an emerging aviation technology specialist at the Civil Aviation Safety Authority. I am also the project lead for this new examination. Joining me are RPAS inspectors Simon Butterworth, Darren McGrath, and our question moderator, Will Whitelaw. Some housekeeping for our session today. Due to the large number of participants in this session, we will be switching all participants' microphones and video off, other than the presenters. This webinar is also being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, the CASA Briefing. We will have a dedicated Q&A session after the presentation, so please make a note of any questions you may have, save them till the end, and we will show you an email address so that you can send in those questions. As this webinar is being presented from Perth, the home and ancient country of the Whadjuk Noongar people, who have been the traditional owners of the southwest of Western Australia for at least 45,000 years, I would like to share with you an acknowledgement of country in the Noongar language. Gaya Wanju, welcome. Non Katich Budia, Buja Ye. Naluk Karajin Buja, Bilia, Mort, Wer. Korndan for Whadjuk Noongar. Doinch, Doinch, Korlin. Kura, Ye were Bodawan. Ye Naluk, Bidi Korling were. Yaking, Borich were Jurapani Kalyaku. So today's webinar will run for about 20 minutes, and we're going to discuss why we need a BVLOS exam, discuss who this exam applies to, describe the BVLOS exam to you, and then we're going to address some of the questions raised in the recent public consultation, and after that, we'll have approximately half an hour for a moderated Q&A session. While you're watching the presentation, please keep a note of any questions you may have. Once the presentation has finished, we will display an email address to which you can send your questions for the Q&A session. I'd like to emphasize that this new exam is intended to create another pathway for people who would have otherwise had to pass the IREX. We are definitely not introducing additional requirements. We are simply giving commercial BVLOS operators an additional option. We have seen a rapid growth in applications for BVLOS operations in Australia over the last decade. This has created a need within the RPAS industry for an alternative pathway to the requirement that a remote pilot should hold a pass in the instrument rating exam, also known as the IREX. Industry called for a more relevant and streamlined pathway for BVLOS operations in Australian airspace, one which would be an appropriate knowledge assessment that relates to what we see as typical BVLOS RPAS operations within Australia. In June 2022, CASA released the RPAS and AAM roadmap, in which the BVLOS exam project was defined. The roadmap also formalizes the timeframe to implement this new pathway. As part of this project, CASA publicly consulted on the proposed BVLOS OCTA outside of controlled airspace standards from the 7th of December 2022 to the 17th of January 2023. In the consultation, we received 127 unique submissions, with a clear majority supporting the proposal, as well as receiving invaluable feedback that helped shape the exam. To everyone who responded, thank you. It is this kind of participation that helps both industry and CASA to innovate and work for the future. If you're unsure what we mean by standards, don't worry, we'll explain that later in the presentation. This new examination is intended to create another pathway for people who would otherwise have had to pass the IREX. The exam is aimed at commercial BVLOS operations. Specifically, it is an exam for a remote pilot who operates under the authority of a Remote Operator Certificate, an REOC. By developing a pathway to cater for the majority of BVLOS operations, CASA is providing opportunities for remote pilots to upskill and qualify to fly in a wider variety of operations. Civil aviation safety regulations will still limit an individual to flight operations within the pilot's visual line of sight. Thus, and a really important point I need to draw your attention to, is that the remote pilot who achieves a pass in this exam is not immediately entitled to fly BVLOS on their own. They must still operate under an REOC, and that REOC must have a BVLOS approval issued by CASA, as we do currently. CASA intends for this qualification to be usable for a broad range of BVLOS operation types. In order to manage differences in skills and tasking requirements for those specific tasks, the REOC organization will be responsible for administering any niche, task-specific knowledge and skills required by that pilot, allowing the organization to control this via induction, training, and competency review allows CASA to apply this exam more flexibly to industry. Keeping in mind that this qualification is still reliant on a chief remote pilot and supporting REOC structure to fully enable this construct. We are not intending to introduce additional requirements beyond this. We are simply giving BVLOS operators another option. As previously mentioned, the IREX is the current mechanism to test a remote pilot and allow them to fly BVLOS. Through a CASA exemption, an IREX qualified pilot can supervise a non-IREX qualified pilot, thus alleviating the burden on the organization from requiring all their remote pilots having a pass in the IREX. CASA's intention is to provide an additional pathway to commonly conducted BVLOS operations. As the majority of Australian BVLOS operations are outside of controlled airspace, OCTA, this was the first and most obvious direction to enable more BVLOS operations within Australian airspace. The IREX will still remain a valid pathway for all BVLOS operations, and for some more complex operations, it may still be a requirement. For example, operations inside controlled airspace or passenger carrying operations. For now, the CASA assessment process will dictate the qualification that is required for a particular type of operation. As we finalize these regulations and policies, we will need to continue to stay agile and be able to adapt with a growing industry. It is for that reason that CASA will assess the required qualifications, commensurate with the complexity of the proposed operation as a result of a risk-based approach. This is why it is important to note that CASA will include the qualification requirement when we issue the BVLOS instrument of approval, so that the crew have a clear understanding of which qualification they will require for a particular task. Note, for now, the IREX will be regarded as a higher achievement when compared to this BVLOS exam, and therefore those who have passed the IREX would not be required to sit this exam after passing the IREX. This may in future be reviewed if new qualifications are added to the RPAS licensing framework. The IREX will likely still have a place for RPAS operations that potentially integrate with conventional aviation, such as AAM, advanced air mobility, high altitude, or perhaps passenger carrying operations. So, how do I train for this exam? Well, once you've decided you require this qualification, you will need to determine how you want to study for it. We expect to sit the proposed standards soon by including them in the Part 101 MOS. Once they are released, it is expected that the providers will also begin to create their training resources in the form of study guides and manuals. You may then elect to study at your own pace in line with the exam standards. Otherwise, as companies or organizations begin to publish training courses, a student may wish to study and attend a training course. But it is worth noting, a training course is not mandatory to sit this exam. This is not an online examination. So when you feel you are ready to sit the test, the exam will be available for you to book through the CASA exam booking portal, which is maintained by our contractor, ASPEC. This will show you the locations, dates and times available, but the BVLOS subject will only appear once the exam is published. We are aiming to have this exam available in the coming months. Further communications will be rolled out closer to the release date. The exam will be a closed book exam, and all materials will be provided at the ASPEC Exam Centre. It will be 40 questions. It will be multiple choice in line with all other CASA exams. The required pass rate is 70%. You will have an hour and a half or 90 minutes to finish the exam, and the only prerequisite is that you must already have an REPL. Once you complete the exam, you will be provided in the exam hall with a result, and that printout will include a knowledge deficiency report, or KDR for short. It is important that you retain this copy of your results, as a pass in the exam will not be displayed on your REPL. If you do not answer a question correctly, the KDR will detail the areas of deficiency to guide you to the subjects that you didn't answer correctly, so you can do a bit of study. If you fail the exam, there is no minimum time frame to resit before you can resit. However, it would be strongly recommended to conduct further study on the identified deficiencies before you have another go. As part of the normal process with these kind of exams, a CASA team will be monitoring them for accuracy and applicability. The questions will be reviewed and then adjusted if that's appropriate and required. So, just to reiterate, that the standards are not currently within the Part 101 MOS, and you will not be able to book the exam just yet, but we will announce and let you know when these are available. This slide is primarily for people and organizations who wish to create or deliver the training content relevant to this exam, but those of you who want to go and study it, this may help you too. From the outset, we have looked to design an exam that caters to the RPAS industry as a whole. The exam is designed to test and evaluate the knowledge required by a remote pilot to safely perform BVLOS operations. This is not to be taken as the exam will be easier than other qualifications. It is an exam that will allow an alternative pathway which is more relatable and appropriate for a remote pilot operating in the RPAS sector. Using the existing crewed aviation licensing framework as our template to ensure a consistent industry approach, CASA's responsibility is to develop aviation training standards that identify to industry the required knowledge and competencies to perform certain operations. CASA publishes these standards in a Manual of Standards, MOS. In this case, it will be the 101 MOS. A syllabus of training for a course or a training manual is then created by an organization or individual who wishes to create the content. They will then publish their content, and a student who wishes to study can then attend a training course in person, or they can purchase their own study material and self-study at home. But the end result is that student can then feel informed to go and sit the BVLOS exam. Through the development of this project, it's become clear that it takes a person with experience in both aviation and training to read and apply a standards document. It is not realistic for a non-aviation experienced person to teach advanced aviation subjects due to the complexities involved and the high standards required to achieve flight safety. It is also not realistic for a person with no aviation experience to self-study using only these standards. However, individuals can use this standards document to determine whether a specific training course they're looking at, a training package, or textbooks cover the required knowledge as contained in that relevant standards document. The content of this qualification draws on knowledge that people with existing aviation industry experience should recognize. Where possible, the source for training content should be from existing aviation training packages and authors. Where there is new technologies and terminology, the terms in use by global aviation authorities and research organizations are what has been deemed appropriate. For example, FAA, EASA, CASA, and the FAA's research organization Assure UAS. The various aviation training organizations, authors, and individuals will be free to create their own training material, which is required to be aligned with the BVLOS OCTA standards in the MOS. This training material, however, will not be assessed or approved by CASA, as the examination will be controlled and kept secure in line with existing crewed aviation examinations. Emulating current crewed training pathways, a candidate can purchase a book from their chosen author or training organization and self-study. If, however, they prefer to attend an online or in-person training course conducted by a training provider, they will have this pathway available to them once those training creators have created their content. This allows industry to develop various pathways leading to the CASA-controlled examination, which provides a level playing field where the quality and type of training is in the control of industry, but ultimately the standards are maintained through the CASA examination. As we finish with our last few slides here, you'll now see that we've put an email address up on the screen for our Q&A session. You can now start to send your questions in, ready for that next session. We are aiming to have the exam available to you in the coming months. Right now, we're working on making sure it meets the high standard required for industry release. Please keep an eye on the CASA website and watch for communications from CASA and/or your industry body or association. Whilst these webinars are a new way for CASA to engage with industry, we hope this is a good way to quickly get across to you what CASA is up to, provide industry a convenient way to ask questions, but most importantly, get those questions answered. As I hope you appreciate, CASA can't always release information until we have agreement, endorsement, or even clearance to do so. However, the flip side of that is that we don't want to wait to release the information only once a product or service is finalized. We want to use this webinar and future sessions to keep you up to date as much as possible, hopefully allowing you to start planning what these changes might mean for you and your operations, and in this case, hopefully, positive changes. If you would like to read in more detail the proposed standards and the associated standards guide, you can go to the CASA Consultation Hub and find them in the closed consultation section, and you're looking for the, in brackets, proposed Part 101 standards and guide for authorized beyond visual line of sight outside of controlled airspace operations, CD Charlie Delta 2216 US. Bit of a mouthful, that one, but if you look on the consultation hub, you'll find it. And on that page, at the bottom of that page, are the documents that you can download and read in slow time if that's what you want to do. Lastly, I would like to draw your attention to an important opportunity for you to get involved. All the work that I have just described was done with industry collaboration through technical working groups. Do you want to be involved? Are you an SME with key knowledge that you want to share so we can develop the Australian aviation industry together? The Aviation Safety Advisory Panel, the ASAP, and technical working groups, TWGs, have been in place since 2017. Since that time, there have been 32 TWGs established involving more than 297 industry experts. They've provided input on topics such as flight operations, flight crew licensing, maintenance licensing, remotely piloted aircraft systems, aviation medicine, continuing airworthiness, and the list goes on. Lots of interaction with CASA. If you are a member of Australia's aviation industry with a genuine interest in the future of aviation safety, please go to the CASA Consultation Hub, where you can register your interest on the expressions of interest. But I would ask you to do one thing for me. Enter some details about your expertise and knowledge so that we can pick the best SMEs for the required work. That concludes our presentation section of this webinar and brings us to the Q&A session. Hopefully we'll have some questions starting to flow in. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Will, who will be our Q&A moderator. Over to you, Will.
Thanks very much, Simon. Yes, we do have some questions starting to flow in, which is great. So just while we wait for a couple more to come through, yeah, obviously quite a bit of information there to unpack, but hopefully we're starting to paint a bit of a picture on how the exam is going to be structured and delivered, and how you might study for that. So yeah, my name's Will Whitelaw. I'm a senior RPAS specialist here at CASA, and I'm lucky enough to be your moderator for today. I'm sure by now you've probably got some great questions bubbling away there. So remember just to pop those into an email and send that over to that email that's up on the screen there at the moment. Now, when they start to come through, I'll be selecting those questions, and then I'll be introducing those to our panelists. So we'll have, of course, Simon Butler and Simon Butterworth and Darren McGrath here to hopefully be able to answer most of those for us today. So we'll start off with something that is probably covered in the presentation, but I think it's quite an important question. So it's pretty, it's a good idea to reiterate. And this is from someone's perspective where they've gone and passed the BVLOS exam. They want to know what they might be able to do with that. Would they still need a CASA approval to operate BVLOS? And we'll probably kick it off with Darren, if I can potentially throw that one to you, if you'd like to start.
Thanks, Will.
Darren.
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Wherever you're calling from, thanks for joining. It just sort of shows the amount of people that have joined this webinar. It really sort of drives home the amount of interest in this new qualification, so that's great. Yeah, look, the answer is yes. You still will need to apply for a BVLOS application for approval as you do now. The exemption is simply intended to create another pathway so the remote pilots and operators don't have to go through the burden, I guess, of studying and passing the IREX exam. So the exam in itself is simply a qualification for the remote pilot to enable them to conduct a BVLOS operation, and that must be done under a remote operating certificate with a BVLOS instrument of approval. So yeah, that's about it on that one, Will. I think Simon covered most of it as well.
Yep, no worries. Okay, thanks, Darren. All right. Another question here has come through about the supervision of, I think this refers to the exemption that currently exists now, where we allow, as Simon had mentioned, an IREX qualified or someone who's passed the IREX to then supervise another crew member who possibly hasn't passed the IREX. And the question relates to whether or not we'll still be allowing that to occur. There's probably a follow-up question after that. We might kick that off if you would like. Simon Butterworth, two Simons, so I'll have to use the full name. Apologies for that. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks very much, Will. And like Darren said, welcome to everybody. Look, that's a really good question. Obviously, people out there that have been involved with BVLOS operations would be aware of the exemption 4621 and the ability to be able to supervise remote pilots that don't hold the IREX qualification. So at this current state, CASA is currently reviewing that exemption for the supervision of remote pilots. The original intent of the exemption was to facilitate, obviously, industry to conduct BVLOS operations without the requirements of all crew having the IREX qualification. This exemption and requirement for IREX will continue to exist for operations within controlled airspace, but we're currently reviewing its applicability to the new BVLOS examination.
Thanks, Simon. And I think you've just answered the follow-up question there, which is great. Thank you.
Perfect.
All right. So the next question relates to where you can do these exams. And so the person's asking about, where that might possibly be, where they might have to go. And so that would be obviously a topic in relation to our exam contractor, but I'll let Darren, we'll take this in turns, I suppose, unless anyone jumps out at me. Darren, if you'd like to have a chat about that one.
Yeah, so as Simon mentioned, Aspect will be hosting the BVLOS exams. They have exam centres around the country. So they're currently, conducting exams for crew licenses. They have the website shows all the locations. They're generally 2 or 3 in the major cities. And when the exam becomes live, you can check online for available time slots and register, and then just go and sit the exam when there's a time that suits you.
Great, thanks, Darren. The next question kind of falls into my expertise area, so I might even have a go at being one of the panelists for just a moment. And this one relates to where the results might sit, and this person has made an assumption that it might sit in the My CASA section of the CASA website, which is a logical place that we would probably put that, given that we are holding our registration system in there as well as accreditation. For the time being, all of the exams that are done through the Aspect or the PEXO, it's sometimes referred to, system will sit on an actual different website, and I'll grab a link to that in a second, and we might be able to put that up. But it would show you all of your results for your theory exam passes and ratings, etc. Typically before now, that was only relating to crewed licensing, and so that's where it will be added initially. We'll probably review whether or not we can add that BVLOS as it relates to RPAS, that exam mark potentially to My CASA, but for now it will sit on the other portal. I'll grab you the address soon. And so the next question we have from the audience is around flying FPV. And I think this person would like to understand how this might apply, how this new exam might apply to flying FPV. And might throw to Simon. You've come off mute. Thank you for that indication. That's great.
Yeah, I thought I'd volunteer for that one, Will. Thanks very much. Obviously, the new BVLOS exam is obviously tailored for BVLOS operations. Anybody or any remote pilot looking to be operating down the FPV path, if they're operating for commercial, they obviously can utilise, if they're operating under recreational FPV, they can obviously utilise the Model Aeronautical Society and their standard operating procedures at clubs. Or if it's being conducted via a commercial operation, we obviously have the approval system under extended visual line of sight class 1 operations. At this current state, or under the current exemption for IREX, there is no requirement at this stage to hold a pass or an IREX qualification for class 1 EVLOS operations.
All right, thank you, Simon. The next one relates to training, and I know we saw a slide there from Simon before about how potentially people might build training courses or training materials, but this question asks when do we expect MOS updates to happen to allow organisations to build training. So we can maybe somewhat to clarify that MOS requirement.
I can talk to that one.
Thanks, Simon. Butler.
So as part of the consultation that we did ending in January of this year, the standard was written and was put out to consultation. We got some good feedback, and only a handful of points were amended, changed, or removed. So the process is that we publicly consult with you, which we've done. Then it's just a matter of us internally going through our processes to get it authorized, at which point we can publish it, and it will then appear in the MOS, and that will trigger the exam being available and training orgs to go and create their content. If they want to get ahead of the game, they can look at the consultation hub documents to give them an idea, a flavor of what's required but ultimately the final document will be published as soon as we can get it done for you, honestly. Over to you, Will.
Great, thank you. And we've got a few questions from the same person here. They're all very good ones. So if we have a look at the next one, which asks about the costs, maybe talk about what people might consider in terms of cost for the exam.
I'll go with that one again.
No worries, you can't stop you now.
In the consultation, one of our questions that we asked you was for the CASA fee. And the fee we proposed was $70, which is only a few dollars more than the current fee. And that is applied to every exam. The rest of the fee is dependent on the elapsed time for the exam set by ASPEC, our contractor. So until we get final approval, we can't give you the final confirmed number, but we expect it to be in the region of existing relatively short CASA exams. So it won't be through the roof expensive, and it isn't an annual fee. It is a one-off per exam fee. That's important to note.
Good stuff, thank you. And would there be any currency requirements if someone's passed this exam? Do they have it for life, or would they be looking at needing to renew that or do that exam thereafter again to renew it? Probably pick on Darren because you've been quite quiet lately.
Thanks, Will. No, the exam qualification will remain. It won't lapse. That's in line with sort of Part 61 conventional aeronautical exam. So once you've done the theory pass, that's it. You've got it, and it sits there in your history, and you can exercise the privilege as we discussed earlier. And yeah, so we'll leave it at that. That's basically the same format as I said as Part 61. So.
It might be worth pointing out to people, though, that whilst they may not be able to see the exam pass or any details, CASA can. So you don't have to necessarily worry that you can't see it, because when you come to do your application for your instrument of approval, CASA can see it, and they can talk. The inspectors will then talk to you about what you've got and what you need.
Thanks, Simon. And probably on the topic while we're here about licensing and what might appear on a RIPL, etc. There's a question here around whether a medical might be required. And so I guess it might be worth clarifying how that privilege is displayed, and it probably won't relate to a license necessarily. It'll be like other exams that you might do for say a private pilot license or a commercial pilot license. They'll be held in the system. You'll be able to access your marks and whether you passed or failed on the portal, and you'll also have that piece of paper that exists at the point of doing the exam and finishing the exam on the day. And also, sorry, CASA can do a reprint if required of that. So at this point, medical wouldn't come into it because it would be unrelated to a particular exam. So at this point, there's no medical requirements for RPAS generally, and that's the way that will stay. Next question is around where we can use this privilege, and this question makes an assumption that maybe it's only below 400. So I can throw to, let's say, Darren, if possible, and we might have a chat about where, when you pass this exam, what can you do with that?
Yeah, okay, thanks, Will. Good question. So the exam's intent is to cover all operations in outside controlled airspace, so Class G airspace, so that it's not altitude limited in that regard. So as long as it's in line with the instrument of approval, then this exam qualification will cover all those operations. For anything else, or for any sort of complexity involving integration into crewed airspace, for instance, into controlled airspace, then the IREX will still be required.
Great, thank you. And we have a question here about the KDR. So the KDR is a knowledge deficiency report. People who have done Part 61 type of license exam will probably be familiar with that terminology, but the KDR is more or less the report that you get. Say, for example, if you pass the exam at 80% or 85% and you have some questions that you got wrong there, you'd be issued, as well as your notification to say that you've passed, you'll be issued a piece of paper that says these sections will need to be reviewed because they are the areas that you got your questions wrong in. So that the question there is, do we need to keep the KDR? What do we do with that? And so maybe Simon Butterworth.
Yeah, thanks, Will. Look, good question. And as most industry participants would know, that the knowledge deficiency area, with regards to the exam itself, you will certainly be identified where your knowledge deficiencies are. But at the end of the exam, there will be no need for you to resit those components. We would expect you to review those knowledge deficiencies and go away and just study upon those areas. But at this point in time, there'll be no need to resubmit any answers to those knowledge deficiencies.
Good stuff.
Will, and just to extend on that, the knowledge deficiencies in the Part 61 world are normally taken care of at the rating stage. So, for instance, IREX, you sit the IREX exam, and the examiner, when you conduct your practical rating, your IREX instrument rating, the examiner would test those. So, at present, we don't operate. This is not intended to be a rating, so therefore we're not closing off those KDRs.
It's probably useful to keep that KDR report, though. If you know, in the future, CASA, for example, did look at bringing in a rating type of system for BVLOS or otherwise, because we would, if with that addition of the practical component, i.e. a flight test, etc., then we might want to look at you know, addressing any of the KDRs that were originally looked at. But for now, to be very clear, whilst it's a good idea to keep that report, it won't be addressed and it won't need to be ticked off, so to speak, you know, at this point in time.
It's also your certificate of achievement, and it's your proof that you've passed it, so please don't lose it.
It is, yes. Thank you, Simon, for the wise words. Very true. Okay, our next question, it says, does one pilot need the BVLOS approval under the new exam, or does every pilot need to sit the exam if you don't have the IREX? So it's probably just a matter of clarifying how the BVLOS approvals here apply and how crew might need different qualifications. If Darren, did you want to cover that one for us? I knew this probably will continue to pop up. It's a very hot topic in understanding how you know, how this exam and what privileges come out of that then apply to particular approvals. So thanks, Darren.
Okay, I'll try and answer that the best I can. You might have to guide me through that question again, Will, but look, essentially the exam or the qualification will allow a remote pilot to conduct a BVLOS operation under a REOC. That's probably as simple as it gets. Was there a question about further complexity, Will?
I think that answers it. Maybe just to say that you know, the current process could still exist. So if you've already passed IREX, we're not asking you to go and sit this BVLOS exam. The IREX already covers you.
Correct.
Potentially for someone who doesn't have that hasn't sat the IREX, they might choose to sit this new exam. Yeah, that would be stipulated basically at the point at which you get your BVLOS approval from CASA. CASA is going to stipulate which qualification your staff, your crew will actually need. In many cases, hopefully in 99% of cases, for most of the tasking that we see today, the BVLOS exam will cover that requirement. Okay. Oops. Now, sorry, I'll just go to the next one. Do you envisage the BVLOS exam will apply to a large domestic drone that is operated from registered aerodromes in IMC and controlled through SATCOM? And I guess there's an extra piece at the end of this that says, you know, the entire operation will be BVLOS and at quite a long range.
Yeah. So a large UAV, was that, Will?
Yes, it does say large domestic drone, so we're going to assume a very large one.
In IMC, yeah. Look, I think this, you know, potentially could be driven by the SORA a little bit as well, around the qualifications, you know, covered under OSOs, you know, suitably qualified crew. I think we discussed earlier that, you know, you know, we expect some applications due to their either integration with other airspace, so being in IMC, that they will then require the IREX qualifications. So,
yeah, that's a good point, Daniel. Just to add on that, that's we would certainly need to consider it as part of the entry control. Once the application comes in, we would look at determining the best avenue and qualifications required on conducting that type of operation.
Right, thanks guys. The next one comes back to training, and this says when the RTOs write the content for the training packages, who will audit that package for accuracy? It's a very good question. And I think Simon Butler, we've pressured you into this one too. Thank you.
Yes, that's okay. The good news is nobody needs to audit that training content. So back in the presentation, we had the slide of the pathway from standards to creating the content to student studying and then the student sitting the exam. Because we hold control of the examination, the end stage, everything before that is up to you, industry. If you go and create a training course and it's for a bespoke way of doing BVLOS, as long as that ties in and answers to the standards that CASA have written, which the examination is written to, go for it. We will only control the examination and we will not be vetting your content. So there is no cost and time for training organizations or individuals for getting things approved, unlike we've had in the past. We're moving to an easier system where we control the exam.
Good stuff. Thank you, Simon. The next question says, will there be a specific section for thermal night operations in the BVLOS exam if that happens to be the only kind of operation I'm conducting? And it's obviously quite specific, but this is probably a good segue into discussing how we had an aim, I guess, to keep the exam quite generic. I don't want to talk about this whole piece because I'll leave this to our panelists, but how our intention was to keep this applicable to as many different operation types as possible. Did someone want to elaborate on how we actually do that and rely then on the REOC? Or if I've steered you in an unknown direction, you don't know what I'm talking about, I can keep talking. If someone comes off mute, we can roll from there. Thanks, Darren.
Yeah, so just talk us through the question a little bit again, Will.
So, well, this question asks about, you know, more or less you know, they're doing a very specific job, and
Yes.
would I see kind of content in the exam relating to my very specific job? And I guess I'm going to answer this first part of that and say no. CASA had an intention to keep this as applicable to as many different operations as possible, and therefore we didn't want to get down into very nitty gritty details on very, you know, finite topics.
Yeah, that's true, and we've sort of discussed before that this is an exam that's meant to be covering operations that are happening today. And I mean, the example in the Part 61 world is you can get a commercial pilot's license and then go off and do many different fields with that, get additional ratings and so on. And I think Simon Butler touched on it briefly in his slides that the future may need more fine tuning and more ratings involved. It can't fit every scope. I mean, the industry's changing so fast as well, and it's a real challenge to create something to cover every specific niche within that. So it's meant to be a syllabus that builds on the foundation knowledge of an REPL, and then expand beyond that, the core knowledge, introducing, you know, high level concepts that align with Part 61 theory components, for instance. Yeah, look, I'd go back to that analogy. You might only want to be a crop dusting pilot, for instance, but you still have to get a commercial pilot's license potentially, and then another rating to go off and do that. So that already exists in the crude world, for instance.
But can I add in, that's a really good question. And whoever sent that question in, please go to the consultation hub and sign up for the expressions of interest for future working groups, because clearly you're a niche SME and we need your input, we need your help. So please sign up. Thank you.
And that's, I just had a comment come through also too about how, you know, well, to start with, it's a challenge for CASA to be able to create the exam that caters for absolutely everyone and everything. But that's why we do try to, as much as possible, involve industry from the outset in developing, you know, the content and the structure, how it's implemented, etc. So as someone said, be as involved as possible. We don't pretend to have all the answers here at CASA, so, and we love that feedback and that constructive input. Okay. Next one. Will there be any resit limitations? And I think this person also asking, is there with IREX also? Oops, sorry.
So the process we've gone for with this exam mirrors what the IREX has and other Part 61 licenses have, in that you can do 3 goes at it. Once you've done your 3rd go, if you haven't been successful, you will need to go away and do self-study and more work before you'll be allowed a 4th attempt. So you get 3 shots, and then to get the 4th attempt, you'll have to talk to CASA, because the system will block you out until it's approved. So good question, but you've got 3 goes. If you fail the first time, and I've failed pilot exam licenses in the past as well, I think most of us have, work, fill the deficiencies, use the KDR to your best effect, and then have another go. And if in doubt, reach out to a training organization or an SME who can help you in industry.
Okay, great. Thank you, Simon. We have a question here that I think it's a fairly general question about where is all this going, and especially for the farming and rural applications for this, especially over wide areas. Maybe we can discuss, you know, how I see this exam as potentially opening the door to people, especially people who haven't had as much involvement in aviation to be able to potentially pass that quite difficult IREX exam, which was the only real pathway before. If I can lead anyone into that and talking about, you know, again, why we see this exam as an important piece in enabling industry potentially. Or have I just said it all? Maybe. Looks like no one's keen. Well, I'll take it then. So if I can answer, this is by saying, look, we realised that the IREX was incredibly difficult. It more or less required a whole bunch of aviation experience, probably to the point where you'd flown a conventional aircraft. And it still even then took quite a bit of study, took quite a bit of time, and it wasn't easy to pass. So yeah, look, we knew for quite some time, you know, that we needed to create this pathway for people who just don't have that background, and how that would be out of reach for some people. So I guess in terms of, you know, directly for farmers, no, I guess this exam doesn't, or this construct doesn't help you directly as an end user or application type. However, I personally think it does allow a lot broader range of people to get into this sector and potentially be able to do tasking that would have been out of reach before. The other thing too, if I can add, is that this adds something to your, you know, abilities list. So if you're a potential pilot who's looking for work or would like to go and take on other kinds of work outside of what you've been able to do so far, then this exam should hopefully enable you to do that and open up the range of things, the range of tasking that you might be able to then go and seek employment inside of. So just noticing the time, we've got about 5 minutes left in the session. We have Darren who put his hand up there.
Oh, yeah, I would say, Will, I think Simon sort of pointed out in his slides that saying it's easier, it's a bit hard to compare. We're saying it's easier than IREX necessarily, but what it is building on it's specific to RPAS and building on the core knowledge of the REPL. And I'd encourage, you know, just when you were talking to points around aviation, non-aviation, and how difficult it is to do the IREX regardless of where you're at. Talk to many crew pilots about the IREX exam, but you know, I'd encourage people to do the REPL if they get, you know, then to back that up with this BVLOS exam while that knowledge is there, because it's just building on what is there, and then increasing that knowledge with some more detail on interacting with crewed aircraft with higher level weather requirements than you would with visual line of sight stuff. So yeah, it's just I think we're trying to make a strong point around it's RPAS specific, and that's a really good thing.
Thanks, Darren. All right, so we might wrap up with one final question. The questions have tapered off, which is quite nice timing. So for the last one here, this person asks if, do I need to pass the new BVLOS exam if I already have a Cert 3 in aviation? And the Cert 3 is obviously the Avi, I think 30419 course that sits outside of the CASA licensing and CASA training organisation approved area. And
the Cert 3 is also a visual line of sight. The Cert 4 is what they've targeted, the beyond visual line of sight. So if you want to compare apples with apples, it would be the Cert 4 that is talking about similar kind of content, but the Cert 3s and 4s don't confer any legal authority in Australia to fly these aircraft. So you would still need, I mean, by all means, study that, because you get the fees, the ability to get fee support and such, but you would still need to come and go through the CASA process and sit the CASA exam for the BVLOS, or go through a training, and before that, go through a training organisation to achieve the REPL. So it's a good start, but it's not the end product you're looking for, I'm afraid.
Thanks, Simon. Okay, so to wrap up our session today, I wondered if there might be just a last quick thought from our panelists, maybe just a quick takeaway to end our session on a high today. I'm going to guess that Simon Butler is going to say consultation, consultation, consultation. So that's his. But I'll start with you, Darren, if you'd like to go first. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. Look, I think it's really going to enable and facilitate a greater level of industry involvement, so in BVLOS operations, and we certainly at CASA expect an increase in the number of REOC operators utilising this exam qualifications, so that they can extend their opportunities in the industry. So yeah, we're bracing ourselves. Simon?
Thanks.
Yeah, no, look, I'd probably concur with what Darren said. It's I think it's a great avenue and an opportunity which previously may have been a little bit more difficult to achieve that qualification of the IREX. So from our point of view, we will certainly be expecting to see more applications coming through for these types of BVLOS operations outside of controlled airspace. So yeah, a great initiative for industry.
All right, thanks, guys. All right, we'll leave it there. I'd really like to thank. There's some virtual clapping happening here. I think if we were in real life, we would all be giving Simon Butler, Simon Butterworth, and Darren McGrath a big round of applause there. Thanks very much for being our panelists today, and thanks, Simon. I'll throw back to you, Simon Butler, just to wrap it up there on the last slide. Thanks very much. Not sure if we.
It
Simon,
helps if I unmute my mic.
There we
How many
go.
years have we
There
been
you
doing
go.
this? Anyway, I got my face. Thank you very much for your time. The last thing I want to close off with is, if you want to know more of what's being thought about, what's being considered, go and have a look at that RPAS and AM roadmap. The people section especially is what the licensing elements are being considered. Please, if you're an SME, that person that came with that question for the, I think the night one, please sign up for the EOI. I want to find out more about that. And if you do have questions, please use the contacts page which on the CASA website, which is on the screen now. And thank you for your time. We look forward to talking to you again in the near future. Goodbye. Thank you.
Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.